What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, the only one it's going to be getting, and seeing as we've been waiting quite some time for it, that's not necessarily a big surprise. With that in mind, the DLC itself launched yesterday from the time of this video, and it brought with it a whole host of changes to various abilities and a patch that also included things like the ability to ride Torrent in the arena of the final boss as an example of some other stuff that it changed. That one in particular, though, I was pretty happy to see because that final boss fight really needed that. But we're here to mainly talk about the DLC, so let's do that. This DLC is going to see us traveling to the Land of Shadow to chase down the demigod Miquella, however it's pronounced, and of course along the way we're going to be picking up new items, including weapons, armor, that we're going to put to good use fighting the new bosses of this DLC and even engaging in a couple of new progression systems across what is a pretty sizable map. So first and foremost, how do we access this new content? Well, provided you have the DLC, you're still going to have to jump through a few hoops in order to actually start it. This involves killing Starscourge Radahn and Bloodlord Mohg. And then, at the back of the arena for the Bloodlord, you'll be able to interact with this cocoon alongside talking to a new NPC that gives you a little bit of background before you're teleported to the Land of Shadow. Now, it's probably worth a mention right there, though, that at least on Steam, the Bloodlord, which is the more difficult of the two, has a Steam achievement that shows off only about 40% of people have beaten that boss. So you might want to jump in and actually play the game for yourself if you have not yet before you decide to spend an extra $40 on this DLC. Especially since this next part is a big deal, the difficulty of said DLC. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the DLC is likely to be a fair bit harder for you than the base game was, not so much because of stat scaling and weapons and gear and all that and how any individual boss works, but rather because the DLC uses its own little self-contained scaling system that is more important than whatever level your character seems to be. Basically, right when you get into the DLC and you start meeting some of the initial NPCs, you're likely to pick up a few different currencies. These Scadutree Blessing Fragments and then the Revered Spirit Ashes. You're going to pick up these items and then spend them at your sites of grace or your resting points to increase your blessings for those, which effectively allows you to deal more damage, reduce incoming damage for both you and then also your summons with each currency respectively, meaning that basically the more you stack up this blessing, the better you'll be able to confront challenges in this DLC. Without these, you're going to get destroyed by stuff, kind of regardless of what your build looks like beforehand, with some bosses just very literally one-shotting you. Which means if you're running into that situation, you're going to have to double back, explore, and find these in order to build up your level of each individual blessing to take on these challenges without being absolutely destroyed. Now, for my money at least, I enjoyed a lot of the bosses and everything that I encountered here, including the new enemies, but this scaling system I was not a fan of. I would honestly just prefer that this DLC scaled the same way the rest of the game does, instead of suddenly being arbitrary based on the number of these things you've collected. Now, that said, I realize they've probably done this in order to encourage exploration and give the DLC a sense of progression, given how long the rest of the game's been out, so you're not just rolling over this DLC with a prepared character. But the thing is, with a game that has a new Game Plus system, I just don't feel that this was necessary. But once you get used to that, and you start getting those blessings built up, it becomes, I would say, pretty reminiscent of what you're used to in terms of this game, given what you'll have had to do to simply get to the point where you could enter the DLC to begin with. Though I will say the bosses have been pretty novel. There's been several that I've enjoyed. I'm trying to mostly just show the early ones here, though. But if I had to guess realistically, given that the difficulty of this DLC hinges upon things that are ultimately finite, meaning you're only ever going to be able to find so many of those blessing items to increase your ability to attack these bosses, which means your chances for mitigation of things like damage that they can do, etc. is limited. I think both the difficulty of this one and the actual just bosses themselves being very over the top in their combos and whatnot is likely going to put some people off, even those who enjoyed the base game a great deal. But regardless of that, let's talk about some of the other things you can get up to. Now, one of the core ideas behind exploration in the Land of Shadow here are the crosses. Basically, your sort of trail marker that lets you know that you're heading in the right direction are these crosses. These are where Miquella abandoned their flesh to cast off parts of themselves, and it's left these crosses in their wake. Finding these is a good indicator that you're in the direction of some plot critical stuff, because otherwise you're pretty much free to explore the area as you see fit, and the area itself is quite large, stretching across several biomes interspersed with little traditional dungeons here and there that usually end in some sort of boss fight, as you might imagine. And that's to say nothing of all the optional dungeons and side bosses that you don't have to do at all, but doing so will grant you access to all the new stuff. One of the other big reasons to check out this DLC, if you've gotten that far in the base game, is simply all the new things you're able to do, such as adding, I believe it's something like 8 new weapon types, such as light greatswords, throwing weapons, some claws, a crossbow, and little things like that, given some time, you might be able to sort out a proper build with, which might just shake up the game's meta, especially since the patch that launched alongside this nerfed and changed a fair few things. But while there are new items to find and new bosses to fight, ultimately the core ideas at play here are exactly the same as the base game outside of the scaling, meaning that gameplay-wise, not much is changing here, really. In fact, in terms of what there is to see and do, it mostly just feels like they tacked on another area to the already pretty sizable map of the base game, albeit with brand new beautiful vistas to see. Now, outside of just the usual suspects, we do get some new quests and things and the likes in the form of brand new NPCs attached to this area, themselves following the trail of crosses, looking for answers to questions that they have, which leads to brand new quest lines where the reward for them is typically the armor and things that individual character is wearing, adding more options for you in terms of customization and builds. Now, both these characters and the just overall plot of the DLC, I do think are where the DLC shined for me, at least. It was much easier, honestly, to follow what was actually going on moment to moment, which gives you a pretty good narrative context to why you're doing these things and the new characters you're either helping or hindering. So whether you want to check out all those new items and different ways to play the game, you want to take on the challenge of all these new bosses, play around with this new level scaling system, or simply explore, this DLC has a lot of content on offer, which honestly, for its price tag of $40, it's certainly better. But in terms of recommending it, that gets a little bit more complicated, in my opinion. Now, truth be told, just right out of the gates, I am not as sold on this DLC as a lot of other initial review outlets that announced their scores via the initial embargo. All of them were extremely positive, with this officially being the highest rated DLC ever as of right now. And personally, I don't agree with that. I think The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine is still better than this overall, especially from a narrative standpoint. However, that doesn't change the fact that this still is a very good DLC with a ton of different things to offer. However, when it comes down to whether or not anyone else should buy it, it's really up to a few different factors. I would say first and foremost, are you even one of the people who can access the DLC to begin with, given the requirements to do so, because spending that kind of money on a DLC you might not even get around to actually touching would be a little unwise. And then once you get into that DLC, there's a few things you need to be aware of, like the way it scales, which personally I wasn't a huge fan of. And while it's not the worst thing in the world, you can certainly learn to work around it, and I think everything else the DLC has to offer is worth doing so for instance, all these other items and things and weapons and whatnot you can gather and put to good use, but all of those rewards made me want to play the DLC in spite of my distaste for its core system. And all of the content that this particular DLC adds doesn't really reinvent the gameplay or offer anything truly mind-blowing in my opinion. It's simply that it is more content, a lot of it, for a game that was already very, very good. So while I don't think this is the best DLC there's ever been, realistically, if you loved the base game, which a ton of people did, you'll almost certainly enjoy this. Just watch out for some of those difficulty spikes and make a point to farm up those blessings, and I think you'll probably be okay. And if you're good with all of those things, then in that case, I do think this game actually manages to justify its $40 price tag. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.